Now, one of the big scandals of the Reagan administration was called Iran-Contra. Now, backing up a bit, we'll talk more about this when we come to the United States after World War II, but Richard Nixon got involved in a scandal that forced him to resign. And ever since then, our presidents have been fearful that they might be hounded out of office, even as Richard Nixon was, particularly Republican presidents. Democratic presidents have an easier time of it, but Republican presidents run a risk of being hounded out of office. Reagan was Republican. The scandal involved aid to Iran. Now, in 1979, the same year that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Iran and Iraq got involved into a big war. And this war also was to last several years and end with nobody winning. And everybody wondered, how can Iran win? Because then we learned that Iran was receiving replacement parts and equipment from the United States. You know, this was illegal because the United States Congress said that we're not going to aid any country without the permission of Congress. Basically, Congress was tying the president's hand. But somebody in the administration was sending aid both to Iran and to the Contras who were fighting the communists in Nicaragua. That's why it's called Iran-Contra. Aid from the United States did find its way to the communist fighters in Nicaragua, and aid from the United States found its way into Iran. Supposedly when Reagan learned about it for the first time, he got up and said, I want to be the first person to tell the world. And he got up and said, folk, I've just become aware of this. To this day, nobody's ever proven he didn't know. His wife said that he went through long periods at that time where he could not sleep, and also his mind started going bad before. He started suffering Alzheimer's before he left office, so we now know that. It's the same argument used with Nixon. Now, I had a young pupil one time say, the boss always knows what's going on and everything around him. And then someone else spoke up and said, no, we spend half our time on a job trying to keep things from our boss. And look, that is very true. We spend a lot of our time on the job trying to keep things from our boss. The chances are Admiral Poindexter and Oliver North did not tell Ronald Reagan anything. To this day, Congress spent millions of dollars investigating Reagan, was more or less set off the hook. Eventually, Oliver North was freed, exonerated by the courts. Admiral Poindexter likewise. And the scandal seemingly got nowhere. Anyway, that was the big scandal of Ronald Reagan's administration. When Brezhnev passed off the scene, he was followed by a couple of other men who only ruled a short time. These are old men. It was called a gerontocracy. The word gerontocracy means old people ruling. A couple of men followed, whose names I won't bother with, but then the next man of any the next man who we'll remember is Gorbachev. Gorbachev was only 56 years old in contrast to his predecessors who had been in their late 70s and early 80s, so he was a younger man. In fact, Margaret Thatcher said, we finally have a Soviet leader we can do business with. He began to try for reform, and in short order, under him, the Soviet Union began to collapse. All right, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. Now, chapter 27, I want to tell you right up front. Chapter 27 is a repeat of what was said in chapter 26. And again, that's because I wanted to give a special chapter just to the subject of communism. And a lot of what's been said here has already been said. We'll start. Again, start with Stalin. Stalin, go from there to Khrushchev, from there to Brezhnev, from there to Gorbachev. Main thing we remember about Stalin was that he killed the people nearby him. He every once in a while got going what's called a purge. He would get suspicious of people around him and begin killing. And nobody knew who'd be next. Khrushchev, who was working under Stalin, said every day I got up, I feared this day would be my last, and he had reason to fear, but somehow he survived till Stalin was out of the way. Stalin would talk to one of his men one way to pit this man against that one, and talk the other man to pit that man against the first one, in an attempt to keep his staff fighting against each other, to keep turmoil going all the time. Somehow this made him feel more secure if the people hated each other, if the staff hated each other. In 1953, Stalin died under what your book says was mysterious circumstances. There is, or was, a man in the Soviet Union who claimed for years that he had killed Stalin. This cannot be proven. But the Soviet Union told us, back when they wouldn't allow reporters from the West inside, was that Stalin had suffered a stroke that had caused him to lose consciousness. Actually, they said the stroke caused him to lose consciousness and speech. But then again, you can't tell whether the person has lost the power of speech while he's unconscious. American doctors found some fault with the report that the Soviets sent out. Whatever. They then announced that Stalin was dead, and let us see pictures of Stalin in his coffin. The book says, yeah, he died presumably of natural causes, but nevertheless, the circumstances were suspicious. They had a power struggle in which, after a couple of years or so, Khrushchev emerged triumphant. Khrushchev. Khrushchev was to govern the Soviet Union for something like 12 years. And we talked about him a lot when I was in elementary school and high school. I was a high school sophomore when he was deposed in the fall of 1964 during one of our presidential race between Johnson and Goldwater, which Johnson won, but Johnson actually quit the campaign because Khrushchev, Johnson felt like his presence was needed in Washington. Because the ouster of a leader always leads to some instability, particularly in a place like the Soviet Union. Anyway, Khrushchev, one of his first official acts was to denounce Stalin. He shocked the world one day when he got up and made a speech that lasted some time, just scathingly denouncing Stalin and Stalinist policies, and announced that the Soviet Union would not follow Stalin's policies, and he called his policy de-Stalinization. Later, Brezhnev was to undo a lot of Khrushchev's reforms. Now, Khrushchev was a joke cracker and a clown man, and a lot of the people in the Soviet Union did not like that. He went on a vacation one day, and I believe it was at the Crimea, southern part of the Soviet Union. Oh yes, one thing, Khrushchev made news recently. Khrushchev was Ukrainian, and Khrushchev had to sit and watch while Stalin killed 15 million fellow Ukrainians by starvation. So when Khrushchev got into power, he gave the Crimea, which was one of the richest parts of the Soviet Union, gave the Crimea to his state, the Ukraine. And that is why, until 2 months ago, the Ukraine still claimed the Crimea. Again, Khrushchev had given it to him. Now, the Crimea has been going back and forth for hundreds of years. At one time, the Muslims had it. The Ottoman Empire had it. At one time, Poland had it. Russia has had it. Austria has had it. And then, most recently, the Ukraine had it. Now Russia has it again. So the Crimea has gone back and forth, and partly because the Crimea has a warm water port that Russia has always wanted, always needed. Anyway, Khrushchev was visiting the Crimea, I believe, and all of a sudden he noticed he'd pick up the phone to call back the Kremlin, and nobody would answer his calls. Well, naturally, he became concerned, so he quickly got in an airplane and flew back to Moscow, went to the Kremlin. There he found everybody in the Kremlin ignored him, and finally he was called at a meeting of the party officials. And there he sat for 2 hours, it says stone-faced, as the party read him out of the party, denounced him in the most scathing terms they could denounce a man. But they didn't kill him. They sent him home in disgrace. he went to live with his children, and one of his grandchildren told the teacher, said, "Grandpa cries all the time. I never see him looking happy. Every time I'm there, he's crying all the time," referring to Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was to live a good many more years. He finally came out of hiding long enough to talk to some American reporters who eventually were allowed in, and he affirmed that I still believe in communism and its eventual triumph. He died, I believe, in 1970 or 71, somewhere in there, having never regained his foothold. Again, what happened to Khrushchev is typical of the way communism has treated its people. As soon as we're through with you, we'll just shove you aside, either kill you or shove you aside. We don't want you anymore. Brezhnev took over. Now again, that was not peaceful, not easy. After Khrushchev, there was a power struggle of sorts. And out of the power struggle came Brezhnev. Brezhnev was to govern for some 18 years. Your book has a vignette on the top page 794 of Khrushchev denouncing Stalin. Anyway, now, a big problem that the Soviet Union had was their economy always remained stagnant. I mean, after a big start, after the end of World War II, they started off going, actually, the farming's too. I mean, let's say they were here where they were before the war. Then the war, of course, stalled them a little bit. When the war was over, they shot right back up really fast until they got near where they'd been before, and then they stagnated. It was like their economy had the ability, whether it be farming or industry, to produce so much and could never break the barrier, could never get any higher. And they were short on housing. Now, I had a young lady from Russia a few years back who said, oh, they weren't really that short on housing. That's, of course, I've heard all my life that they were. Your book said they were, but they'd be that. Were they short? She said, well, they were short in places like Moscow, maybe in St. Petersburg, and Leningrad, perhaps. But they just generally were not that short on housing, except only in big cities. Of course, I've heard all my life that they would double up 2 or 3 families to a house. And they continued to be. They somehow just could not catch up. Soviet Union was famous for its 5-year plans. You people practice austerity for 5 years. Into 5 years, we'll give you a Western-style type of life. The people would practice austerity for 5 years. You know, deprivation, doing without, and at the end of 5 years, they're worse off than they've been to begin with. Now, I want to say this about their education system, then I want to digress a bit to their space program, which somehow your book leaves off. Your book does talk about their education. The Soviet Union did not have any discipline problems all the way from kindergarten through graduate school. Unlike American schools where the kids are allowed to cuss the principal and sass the teacher, they seem to have had none of that. And also their children did 4 or 5 hours worth of homework a night. The children go home to school, hey mom, I got to do some homework. And they'd sit there and do homework end on end. You would think with all that they would forge ahead. In fact, they had us scared. They got the first satellite in orbit ahead of us. And everybody said American education is lousy. We began to pour money into our educational system. But here's what I think was wrong with the Soviet educational system. It was controlled from the top. Whereas American education was free, the students chose not everything they took, but chose their own course in the curriculum. Another big difference was, in the Soviet system, once you had failed, adios, you're gone for good. In our country, you can fail at one thing and try again at another and have a chance to succeed. I mean, I think I've told this class more than once how that Michael Jordan was cut from a junior high basketball team, and any of you who know about Michael Jordan, I mean, he was the best player in the court as a pro, but he was cut 2 times for incompetence. If he had grown up in the Soviet Union, once he'd only been cut 1 time. He'd never been given another chance. They told a famous baseball manager about this player who'd played a whole season and hadn't committed a single error. The manager said, forget it. Any player who doesn't commit an error isn't trying. And any one of you who's played a game knows if you're really trying hard to win, you're going to allow something once in a while. You're going to go for a play you can't quite make. It's the nature of the game. But a player who played, basically the Soviet Union did not allow its students to make errors. The pressure on them was intense. You were only allowed to fail one time. And when you failed, and they wound up, I really believe that a lot of the young men who wound up shoveling coal in their minds might have made medical doctors over here. And a lot of the men who they made medical doctors might have wound up shoveling coal over here. Maybe not that bad, but basically they wound up destroying their people more than did creating them because of the sheer lack of freedom. Now the space race, which I must mention because I'm a space